In October 2004, loving wife Rachel O'Reilly returned home after doing the school drop-off. Less than 20 minutes later, she was murdered by her own husband.
Joe O'Reilly killed his wife in the most brutal possible manner. He hit her across the head with a dumbbell several times, inflicting unbelievable injuries. This was a cruel, calculated murder.
In a horrific attack made to look like a burglary gone wrong, Joe O'Reilly killed the mother of his children.
Terrible legacy to leave those kids. That's their legacy for the rest of their lives. Their mother was murdered and their father did it.
Joe O'Reilly revelled in the attention he received as he paraded himself on TV.
He went on the Late Late Show with Rose to make an appeal for whoever murdered his wife to come forward or for people to give information.
He really was enjoying it.
She knew the person because why else would you kill her?
He enjoyed the spotlight.
Thank you very much.
As the whole of Ireland watched on, Joe O'Reilly proved himself to be one of the world's most evil killers. October 4th, 2004, at around 5:20 a.m., Joe O'Reilly left his home in Knowle in the north of County Dublin. The married father of two went to the gym before heading to the outdoor advertising company he worked for in the west of Dublin city. At 8:25 a.m, he left the office again and arranged to meet a colleague at a bus garage 5 miles away in central Dublin.
He said they had to do an inspection in Broadstone that day to examine the buses and the advertisements, and he said he was there until 12 o'clock or wherever he came back to his workplace.
But O'Reilly never made it to the bus garage. Instead, he travelled 25 miles north to his family home, where his loving wife Rachel was unaware of what her husband had planned for her.
Joe O'Reilly was an arrogant, over-self-confident man with no respect for anyone except his own desires. And the person who paid the price for that was his wife, Rachel.
This killer's story begins in County Dublin, Ireland. Joe O'Reilly was born in April 1972. One of 4 children, O'Reilly didn't have the easiest of childhoods.
Joe grew up in a troublesome household. His father was an alcoholic and a robust type of character and violent. Joe would have been subject to a lot of drunken abuse by his father. He had one other brother and he had 2 sisters. One of them was very mentally handicapped and physically handicapped. And Joe had told me himself, my father come in and I could hear him shouting downstairs, "Where's the monster, where's the monster?" referring to my handicapped sister. And he come up, I'm going to kill that, I'm going to kill it, I'm going to kill it now, you know.
According to O'Reilly himself, he was the doting big brother, protecting his baby sister from being harmed.
He said, I'd have to hop up out of bed, grab the baby out of the cot and hide her under the bed with me. And he'd come in and he'd be roaring and shouting, and then he says, that's what I had to put up with. So I would sympathise with Joe, and that, you know, no one wants to see that type, but he did have a troublesome childhood.
It wasn't a comfortable upbringing. It was complicated, and he did feel responsible for his siblings. But there was also a hint of arrogance in that childhood.
As an adult, Joe O'Reilly was a hard character to read, with those around him not knowing too much about him.
Joe, he was always very, very aloof. I don't think any of us ever had a real understanding of him. He never got too close to any of us. Never standoffish either. You just never would have got to know him. He just seemed shy guy, like.
In 1991, O'Reilly was working in retail in the centre of Dublin city. And this is where he met 17-year-old Rachel Kalali.
Rachel and Joe met at a large department store in Dublin. He fancied her early on, and he made several attempts to ask her out, but she wasn't willing at the time. But he kept trying, and she eventually did go out with him, you know.
He takes her to Paris and proposes on the top of the Eiffel Tower. Now, I think that tells you an awful lot about O'Reilly's vision of himself and what he wanted. He wanted to put her on the back foot. He should be the great I am. And I think that that's the tone, the background music that goes through the entire relationship.
From the outside, Rachel and Joe O'Reilly appeared to have the perfect life. They soon got married and moved to the countryside in Knowle, County Dublin. Rachel seemed to be living the life of her dreams. Her brother Paul remembers it being a joyous time in Rachel's life.
She loved the country living, the country schools, she liked walking the lane, talking to neighbours and stuff. It was a fine house and they just seemed very happy out there. To us, they had the perfect marriage.
They were committed in many ways, but, and here comes one of the telling elements in this tragic story, he was an arch manipulator. He was one of those men who turned off his affections and on at a whim, always putting a woman in his life on the back foot. It's very familiar among arrogant, manipulative men. Now, did that come from his childhood? Did it come from the way he saw his mother treated by his violent alcoholic father? Possibly. But certainly, there's no doubt in my mind that he was pretty misogynist in his mind.
There was no doubt that Joe O'Reilly had little regard for women, but nobody could have predicted how his marriage to Rachel would turn out. For Rachel, the 4th of October started out like any other day.
Joe had gone to the gym 6 a.m.-ish, and she'd got up, fed and watered the kids, and dropped them off to their play school and school. And she just came home then.
Around 1:30 p.m, Joe called Rachel's family. He told them Rachel hadn't collected their youngest son from the creche.
It would have been very, very, very odd for Rachel not to. Her whole life was based around the kids, their activities.
The thing everybody says about Rachel, she was a dedicated mother. Her main goal in life was to look after her children, and she did that to the best of her ability. She was a really caring mother.
When she became a mother, that was her big achievement in life. Although she loved every other part of life, I think her 2 kids were the sort of pinnacle of her life. So it was very strange when we got that phone call that she had missed one of the children.
Upon receiving the phone call from Joe O'Reilly, Rachel's mum, Rose, knew something wasn't right and headed straight to the house to look for Rachel. What she discovered was horrifying.
The back door was open, the curtains were drawn, and she said that was very unusual, that they never do that. And she went into the house and she could see the tap was running and the drawers were pulled out, and she could see things scattered around, and she was shouting for Rachel, and she made her way down to the bedroom where she would think she would be, and yes, Rachel was there.
O'Reilly had encouraged Rachel's mother to go to the house. For Rose, the devastating scene was one that no parent should ever have to see.
She couldn't even tell if Rachel was lying face down on the floor or face up because of the injuries inflicted on her. There was so much blood and her hair was matted and she couldn't tell, but she knew she was dead.
It wasn't long after that my mother rang, and we knew there was a big problem. She didn't make a whole lot of sense. All she kept saying was, she's dead.
Detective Pat Marry was on duty when a call came through of a violent incident in Knoll.
As I made my way there was messages, conflicting messages coming over the radio. Oh, that lady has been very badly hurt. Yeah, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. Then someone says, yeah, no, that lady I think is dead, like, you know. And I said, my good God.
News spread fast that something big had happened, and journalist Pat Flanagan made his way to the scene.
When the crime was committed, the initial thoughts were that it was a burglary. The house had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, there was clothes all over the floor.
Detective Pat Marry entered the crime scene, and what he discovered horrified even this seasoned police officer. Rachel O'Reilly had been barbarically killed.
It was really a savage assault, and that was shocking to me. And I've seen a lot of dead bodies and a lot of ladies who have been murdered by their husbands and in situations like that, but this was really horrific. The degree of savagery that was used to kill her. Whoever done this to this woman hated her.
Whoever did this had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks and stage a fake burglary.
I've been at thousands of burglaries, and I know what a burglary, and I know when there's one, a real one and not a real one, and this was not a real burglary.
A mother of two had been murdered in her own home in broad daylight. On the surface, the crime scene looked like a burglary gone wrong, with tragic consequences. But to the trained eye, there was something else at play.
I know burglars, I know how they behave, I know what they do. They don't want confrontation. The first thing a burglar will do, he'll get into a house, he'll go to the bedroom, he'll go to the woman's side of the bed, he'll look for all the jewellery, he'll separate the costume jewellery, take the good stuff, put it in a pillowcase, gone. We discovered also that there was 2 lots of money in the house as well, which was never taken, like, you know, so we knew that it wasn't a burglary. We just said, like, there's something not right here, like, you know.
Rachel has been severely attacked, violently bludgeoned, 2 skull fractures, many other bruises across her body. This is not just bang on the head and run out the door. If it's a burglar who's frightened, it's going to be one hit and away. This is not that. This is an attack which indicates rage and indicates, too, premeditation.
The body was removed for a post-mortem at lunchtime. Forensic examination of the house is expected to last a couple of days.
While the Kalali family were hysterical with grief at finding Rachel, Joe O'Reilly seemed quite the opposite.
It wasn't a grieving husband. He was just looking, he was taking in stuff. He didn't act like a guy who had just found his wife battered to death on the floor.
Joe was standing out on the road on his own. He never engaged with the Kalali family or went up to the ambulance to, you know, say what happened or talk about the situation or give each other hugs, or he was just standing there like a cardboard cutout standing on the road there, like, you know, and that was it.
While the public still suspected a burglary, Pat Marry was looking at a different line of inquiry. Later that day, he paid Joe O'Reilly a visit.
We were wondering, like, what was the story with Joe? Like, he gave us an account of his day. He said, yeah, I got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, he says.
O'Reilly told the detective that he'd left the house at 6 a.m. to head to a nearby gym.
He was to meet a friend, a work colleague there. They both chatted, they showered, and then went their ways. This, of course, you know, was to provide Joe an alibi.
O'Reilly, who worked in advertising, claimed he'd then gone to a bus depot to inspect some adverts and to meet another colleague there.
He said he was there until 12 o'clock or wherever he came back to his workplace.
This alibi provided Joe O'Reilly with the perfect cover. If true, he couldn't have been responsible for the murder of his wife.
Maybe, I says, Rachel was having an affair and it was some woman got someone to give her a hiding to tear her back. No, he says, neither of us were having affairs. And I just looked straight into his eyes and I was about 2 foot away from him. I said, Joe, did you have an affair? He says, well, I did have an affair. But it's all over now.
He admitted that he had an affair with a woman, but he claimed it was over and had been, and himself and his wife had sorted out and they were now back to being a happy family.
I'd have been far more surprised if he wasn't having an affair, given his personality and the way that he liked to absolutely dominate everything. He would love an audience, he would love fans, and that's how he would see affairs, really.
Even after the murder, Joe O'Reilly maintained the facade of being the loving husband, regularly visiting the grieving Kalali family at their home.
Every couple of days he'd drop in and stuff. My ma used to make him dinners and all. But that didn't last very long. Anytime he was in the house, he was very calculated, very cautious, didn't say a lot, just listened a lot. He just wanted to know information all the time.
Rachel was buried 1 week after her murder on the 11th of October 2004.
Joe basically just washed his hands at the funeral. He didn't want really anything to do with it. He didn't even want to pay for his wife's funeral.
The funeral was an opportunity for the Kalali family to pay their last respects to their beloved Rachel.
The Calalis were writing cards to put in the coffin, saying their last goodbyes, and Joe was in the house with them. They gave him a card and stuff, and he wrote what he wrote and put it in the coffin. Now, she was buried with these cards.
It wasn't just the family who were in mourning. Well-wishes spread far and wide. The murder had sent shockwaves through Ireland, and there was a huge public interest in the case.
I covered the funeral for the Daily Mirror at the time, and it was quite a big funeral, and very sad that the Calloway family were in tears. But Joe was seemed to be removed from it, you know, as if it didn't affect him.
I suppose the day of the funeral, like, obviously it was a very emotional day, but I think that's when he started going into his kind of showbiz mode. He really, like, when he got up and did his eulogy, he was like, it was like an Oscar speech up there, you know. Like, it was really all about him, you know, and he seemed to love the attention, and that was noticeable, even in our grief.
Joe O'Reilly was quite a dominant and controlling person and felt a kind of ownership over his wife and over his children. He certainly represented himself as a family man. It didn't really follow that up with the way he behaved in his relationship. It was more like, well, this is what I want people to see me as, rather than this is what I really am.
Detective Pat Marry attended the funeral and had become close to the Kalali family over the course of the investigation. Their observations of O'Reilly in the lead-up to the funeral had been playing on their minds.
I was down in their house and we were talking about things, and they said, oh yeah, and Joe was here, sure, he didn't care about Rachel, and we had to tell him to write that note, like, you know. And the detective that was with me, Detective Peter McCoy, the two of us looked around at each other because we thought the same thing. What did he write in the note, you know? And could there be a confession there or anything, like, you know?
With the Kalali family's blessing, detectives made the difficult decision to exhume Rachel's body. They were certain that O'Reilly's note inside her coffin could be the key to unlock the case.
It was a 5-page letter. In it he said, it's the hardest letter I've ever had to write in my life. He asked for forgiveness. And he said, it'll haunt me for the rest of my life. And I hope you forgive me, Rachel.
It's further evidence that Joe O'Reilly is not innocent of the crime of murdering his wife. But at this point, there still isn't enough firm evidence.
He was saying sorry for what he had done, and it's only him and she knew about it. But yet again, it could be anything else. It was ambiguous, and we couldn't use it as, you know, strong evidence.
More was needed to prove Joe O'Reilly had committed the crime. As the investigation continued, the killer put on a horrifying performance for Rachel's grieving family.
I know he was given the house back after a week. We went out with him that day to help him clean up the house, and he had us listening to phone messages for 20 minutes. He made 20 different calls to her saying, "Are you there? I love you." The concerned husband.
This is not the behaviour of a man with much in the way of empathy. It's the behaviour of a man who's seeking to cover his tracks.
O'Reilly then took the family to the spot where his wife was murdered and proceeded to act out how he thought the killer might have ended Rachel's life.
He knelt over where the body would have been and reenacted how he would have bludgeoned her with whatever he bludgeoned her with. He then even stepped over an imaginary body, that wasn't there. He also went to the bathroom and explained how the killer might have washed his hands and heard her gurgling and then went back to finish her off.
Mary Cassidy, who'd done the post-mortem and had viewed the injuries, had said to us in her report, and I confirmed it again with her, what Joe had enacted is exactly what she believed the murderer would have done, based it on the injuries of the head and the body was laying in and all that. So here's Joe reenacting exactly what he did. It was spooky.
Not surprisingly, Jim and Rose are, literally horrified. How could they not have been? They are in the presence of someone who's enacting out a murder and he's only been dead a week or so.
For the Kalali family, the disturbing truth about Joe O'Reilly was starting to become clear.
My father was a little bit hesitant to jump to this conclusion, but the other three of us just said it. He's just admitted it. We knew in our own hearts that he had murdered Rachel, and we just had to play the waiting game then and hope to God the police could get him, could catch him.
After putting on a sickening display for Rachel's family, O'Reilly was going to take his supposed grief to a national level. For his next performance, the cameras would be rolling.
Why go to the extreme of murdering the person unless they can identify him?
While the eyes of the nation watched on, twisted Joe O'Reilly was loving the attention.
Usually when someone is grieving, they're grieving. They don't want limelight. They don't want, they want to be left alone to grieve in peace,
Members of the press, said to themselves, this guy is too open, because he was willing, he was over-willing to give his side of the story. Gradually, the tide turned and, suspicion turned on Joe.
Just over 2 weeks after O'Reilly murdered his wife, he made an appearance on one of Ireland's leading chat shows with Rachel's mum, Rose Kalali.
Murder happened was in the bedroom, which is the very last room of the house. So it's the room where you're least likely to bring someone you don't know because you're cornered.
He went on the Late Late Show as a guest with Rose to make an appeal for whoever murdered his wife to come forward or for people to give information.
Rose is clearly deeply upset and still grieving for her daughter. O'Reilly, by contrast, seems incredibly relaxed.
Mam was very uncomfortable with the whole setup, sitting beside him. And to us it was very obvious at that stage that he really was enjoying it. He enjoyed the spotlight.
He was controlling the narrative from the beginning. He would not have been thinking, I feel ashamed or I feel guilty about this. He would have been totally confident. I can tell everybody I didn't do this and they will all believe me. The bigger platform I have to say that, the more people will believe me.
My view as well would be, and again, it's just my view, it's not a police theory, it's just my own personal belief, is that she knew the person, because why else would you kill her? If it's a violent robbery, why go to the extreme of murdering the person?
If O'Reilly was hoping to put detectives off the scent, his antics instead had the opposite effect.
I can tell you now, that interview with Pat Kenny that night, Joe O'Reilly was suspect number one to everyone in the country.
But it was O'Reilly's behaviour behind the camera that led to one of the biggest breakthroughs in the case, as he spent a lot of time on his phone.
We discovered the person he was on the phone was his lover, and he went and met her after the show, and he spent the night with her, you know, after trying to be on a show to appeal for information in respect of the death of his wife.
O'Reilly had told Detective Pat Marry that the affair was over, but it was just another lie in the killer's story.
We had arrested the girl he was having the affair with, and she was in and she was questioned. She said that they were having an affair and it was a full-on affair and that it wasn't over. Having an affair, it's a motive, and was quite happy that we could establish that motive.
So we have a man who has, if you like, established for himself the kind of perfect marriage. 2 children, nice house in the countryside outside Dublin, good job, progressing up the ladder. On the surface, everything is fine. He's got a new lover. He wants to start a new life with her. He wants to make sure that he gets custody of his children. And so Rachel, without knowing, is watching her husband plan what he believes is the perfect murder, the murder of his wife.
O'Reilly's colleague, who had provided him with an alibi, was arrested and interrogated again about the morning of the murder.
He was questioned at length, and he eventually admitted, look, I think I seen Joe at that stage, but what you're telling me, I must have been mistaken.
The colleague said he never seen him at the bus garage where he was supposed to be.
Joe O'Reilly's alibi had evaporated. He hadn't been at the bus depot that morning. The challenge now was to prove he was at the murder scene instead. An examination of shoes O'Reilly had been wearing that day led to a breakthrough.
The forensic lab examined them, and they found dots of blood on the inside of the shoe, not along the side of the shoe. The drips came from above and down, which would have been synonymous with him at a time he was standing over Rachel or at a time he was killing her with the weapon. So we believed at that stage that we had enough to arrest him on suspicion of the murder of his wife, and which we did.
On the 17th of November 2004, over a month after the murder, Joe O'Reilly was arrested and taken in for questioning.
The arrest came as something as a shock to the public.
We questioned him, and he didn't cooperate. He had no comment. And we put it about the shoes and that, he had no comment. We put it about the phone record and him talking. I don't know, I don't think he had any recollection, or he no comment to make, you know. So we didn't have enough to charge him.
Without a confession, the case against Joe O'Reilly still wasn't strong enough. The Director of Public Prosecutions told detectives they didn't have enough to take O'Reilly to trial.
We represented what we had to the DPP, and the DPP says, no, you're just falling short. I thought we had enough. They were just a little cautious.
O'Reilly was released without charge. With no new developments to report on, public interest in the case started to dwindle.
There was a kind of certainly dropped off the front pages, and Joe O'Reilly felt fairly secure that he had got away with the perfect murder. He thought he was going to be a free man.
The police carried on working quietly in the background to try and prove once and for all that O'Reilly was responsible for the vicious murder of his wife, Rachel.
As detectives began to investigate, they found emails that went between Joe and his sister, and they were very, very derogatory towards Rachel. He said the marriage was over.
Joe says, I can see it, I'm going to be Mr. Weekend Dad if we break up. He wanted the children, he wanted her gone, and that was it. And he knew the only way to get rid of her was to kill her, and he has to make it look like a burglary.
He was quite domineering, and he did exactly what he liked. So I think it's far more likely that his views on divorce were, you're not leaving me. I will decide when this marriage is over, And that's exactly what he did do.
Detectives had to find conclusive proof that O'Reilly had been at the scene when Rachel was murdered. They scoured through hours of CCTV, but it was the cameras from the quarry close to the O'Reilly house that provided valuable evidence.
We had Rachel, she drove a scenic car, leaving her house 9:40 or something like that. She was coming back, her car was coming back. But Joe O'Reilly himself drove a Fiat Maria estate car. And we had that car, we believed that car, going up to the house at 9:10 in the morning and it returning back at 9:59. So between 9:45 and 9:59, that's when Rachel was murdered. So it sort of not ticked our box entirely, but it gave us reasonable suspicion to believe it was Joe O'Reilly's car, you know.
New technology was emerging. Cell site analysis shows which nearby telephone mast a mobile phone is connected to every time a call or text is sent or received. A telecoms company helped detectives analyze O'Reilly's phone data from the day of the murder.
They produced for us a map to show where Joe O'Reilly's phone was pinging off, what mast when he received text messages and phone calls that morning.
The data showed that O'Reilly had left work, travelled through North Dublin to the house where he brutally murdered his wife. This was the vital evidence Detective Pat Marry needed.
So we can establish without any shadow of a doubt, Joe O'Reilly had his phone that morning on his person. And we could show 100% through the cell site analysis that Joe O'Reilly was travelling out from the city out to his home at the time his wife was murdered.
But that wasn't the only breakthrough. On the 14th of March 2006, detectives were tipped off about a conversation O'Reilly had with his lover when Rachel was still alive.
Joe had also told his lover that he would kill Rachel, but she didn't take him seriously. She just thought it was a figure of speech.
Had Joe O'Reilly actually admitted what he was going to do to Rachel prior to her murder?
We arrested Joe's lover again and brought her in and questioned her, and she admitted that Joe said he'd kill Rachel if he got away with it. But I didn't take him seriously. I didn't think he'd do anything, like, you know. It was only said in flippant, like it wasn't anything in it, like, you know.
On the 18th of June 2007, Joe O'Reilly appeared in court, charged with the murder of his wife, Rachel. For Detective Pat Marry, the trial had been a long time coming.
It was quite an intense investigation, and there was a good team of detectives on it, and everyone has the same agenda to get the person who did this.
It had been almost 3 years since Rachel had been killed, and at times the Killally family had almost given up hope of Joe O'Reilly ever facing justice.
We always knew the hardest thing was to get him into court. It was 3 years later, he was still walking the streets, still living his life, still happy out. So it was a huge step to get him charged.
The trial was the final chapter in a story that had from day one attracted intense public interest. Journalist Pat Flanagan covered the trial at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin.
There were queues down the street for the public to get in. In fact, I was there that morning and I had difficulty getting through the crowds to get into the courthouse. I think a lot of people thought he was going to get off because, of course, they didn't know how watertight the police case was against him.
While the facts of his actions were laid bare in court, O'Reilly showed little emotion.
During the trial, Joe, he seemed very relaxed. In fact, he was looking around the court. He didn't seem particularly worried, at the time. He had the demeanour of a man who felt he was beyond the reach of the law.
The trial was especially difficult for the Killally family, as painful details of Rachel's murder were revealed. As the post-mortem results were discussed, the Killallies were reminded of the weeks following the murder, when Joe O'Reilly acted out how the murderer would have likely killed Rachel.
You might say you saw the body and all, like when you hear, and I know he reenacted it and all, but it was only when we were told exactly what happened that we knew his reenactments were actually real. But it's barbaric what he did. It's horrific. So he got great joy out of doing them.
He used more violence than was necessary to kill his wife. There was rage in that, there was resentment in that, but it was also cold-blooded, planned execution of his wife. You are in my way, and I'm going to get rid of you. That says so much about the type of person that he is.
On the 20th of July 2007, at the end of the 4-week trial, the jury went out to deliberate. Despite the prosecution painting a picture of a man who had reason to kill his wife, there was still doubt as to whether O'Reilly would be punished for his actions.
There has to be concern because I think there was 11 jurors in the end, and it only takes a couple of them and you're in trouble. I had gone over to a local pub with the guards and we were chatting. None of them were confident, you know. They were all just, you just never know with a jury. So that kind of diminished me a little bit.
Detective Pat Marry waited anxiously with the Colali family. After less than 24 hours of deliberation, on Saturday, the 21st of July 2007, the jury had made their decision.
I remember being with the family. We went down to the pub and we were having a pint of Guinness. And I remember I just had one call and it was sitting in front of me and next people come in. The jury are coming back, the jury are coming back.
Back in the courtroom, the jury delivered their verdict, a unanimous guilty. Joe O'Reilly was finally convicted for the murder of his wife, Rachel.
The whole court just erupted. The judge was banging his gravel on it and there was nobody was paying any attention, like, you know. It was a huge release of emotion that justice had been done, like, you know. And I think the whole country were shouting. And I was standing there and Rose came over to me and she gave me a big hug. And I started crying as well. And I cried and I make no bones about it.
Well, thankfully he was found guilty. The only way I can describe it, it's like taking the air out of a balloon. It just, you nearly collapse and yet you nearly jump to touch the sky. It's an amazing feeling. It was very emotional, you know.
This supremely confident, indeed you might say arrogant man, is finally cut down to size by a jury of 12 of his peers who see through his supreme confidence for what it is, merely that, a pretense that, oh, he couldn't possibly have killed her, it was an outsider, an intruder. It's one of the most cold-blooded of killings it's possible to imagine. O'Reilly is nothing more than a cold-blooded, calculated murderer.
Joe O'Reilly was sentenced to life imprisonment and was taken first to Dublin's Mountjoy prison before transferring to Midland Jail to serve his sentence.
Life imprisonment in Ireland is anything now between 18 and 23 years, but people do serve a lot longer than that. And I suspect Joe O'Reilly will serve maybe 30 years. Hopefully never gets out.
But being found guilty didn't stop Joe O'Reilly from appealing his conviction, which he did in 2009.
Joe O'Reilly was so confident that he would win his appeal that he told inmates when he was in prison that he'd move back into the house where he murdered his wife as soon as he was released and bring his 2 children with him.
O'Reilly lost his appeal and remains in prison. But for the Colali family, the nightmare continues.
He was found guilty, he did his 7 years, and every 2 years after that he's applied for parole. What we have to do as a family then is every 2 years when they contact us, we have to write letters, send them in why we think he should stay in jail. So, you know, it just seems a bit unfair that we're not actually the guilty party here, and yet we've to kind of beg to keep him in jail.
For many people in Ireland, Joe O'Reilly remains a threat to society.
I believe Joe O'Reilly is a total psychopath. He has no empathy for anybody. When he could do that to his wife, he could do anything.
He was evil, evil to the core. And if he got out, could he do it again? Yes, he could. Joe O'Reilly, in my mind, is an evil person.
People like Joe O'Reilly don't change. This is who he is. He killed Rachel because of the way he is, the way he thinks, his world view, his ego, his entitlement. That's not going anywhere. There's a danger that he will behave in exactly the same way in future relationships as he did in his past relationships.
Rachel lost her life at the hands of the evil O'Reilly. But she was not the only victim of this devastating crime.
Your biggest hope is, like, the two boys that lost their mother, and you just hope to God it wasn't the father. Like, if it was a burglary or anything else, I'm not saying it would be any easier, but at least they'd be left with their dad. So I think once that realization came in that he didn't just take our sister, he took their mother, which, to me, like, I think that's barbaric. No matter how much you hate someone, it's a terrible legacy to leave those kids. You know, that's their legacy for the rest of their lives. Their mother was murdered and their father did it. Who knows what she would have went on for? Rachel had endless possibilities. Like, she was such a doer, such a giver, such a great mother, great sister, great daughter. She could have done that in life. It's just a shame he just cut her dead like that, and, you know, all that possibility was lost. He destroyed her for the years leading up to her death, so we all just hope he rots in prison.
Joe O'Reilly fell out of love with his wife and wanted to move on with his lover. Instead of getting a divorce and fighting for custody, he chose to end the marriage in the most final of ways, by brutally murdering Rachel and depriving his two children of their mother. O'Reilly was a selfish man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and he will be remembered as one of the world's most evil killers.